let's take a look at today's agenda. We'll be talking with our speaker, Kyle Lundby, today on the recipe to ignite better people practices, focusing on 5 leadership essentials. And we'll first talk about managing with bifocals, understanding employees, understanding HR leaders, understanding and applying analytics, and finally nurturing a global mindset. And we will allow plenty of time for you guys to type your questions into the question and answer bar at the bottom. Feel free to ask them at any time. There's another live webcast this evening at 9 o'clock Central Time tonight for our Asian colleagues. And so if you like what you hear and would like a link to have one of your colleagues register for that, just let me know. There'll be contact information at the end. So I'll introduce our speaker, Kyle Lundby. He's Valtera's Director of Asia Pacific. Kyle returned to the U.S. after living and working in Hong Kong with his family. He consulted and developed business throughout the region, and he is the editor of a recently published book, Going Global, and he's a frequent speaker on global talent issues and a member of Valtera's senior leadership team. Kyle got his PhD in IO psychology from the University of Tennessee, which the other Orange School. I have to display a little bit of nationalism here since that will be one of the themes that Kyle will talk about. And of course, I went to the other Orange team, the University of Texas. He's a marathoner and has 2 daughters. I'm Susan Palumbo, and I'm Valtera's Senior Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing. Just as a bit of a backdrop before we invite Kyle to our stage, so that you have an organizational context for our point of view around today's educational website, is that Valtera has been around since 1977. We are involved in talent management programs, oftentimes taking the form of employee surveys, assessment for development, section for hiring. We have offices in the U.S., 2 in Europe, and we'll be opening up an Asia-Pac office in early 2012. Best known for our clarity, providing facts, the evidence, not hunches, to help our clients answer pressing business questions. With that, I'd like to invite Kyle Lundby, our speaker, onto our virtual stage. You join me and sit right here in that comfy green chair, and we'll talk a little bit about the 5 leadership essentials. Welcome, Kyle.
And I will sit in that comfy green chair, and I'm very happy to be here. I almost missed sitting in this comfy green chair because of some technical difficulties on my side, but we seem to be okay now. So thank you, and thanks for attending this WebEx session today. Let me start. I have control of the slides. Maybe there we go. For those of you in global organizations, now this is going to come as no surprise, really. Our domain of responsibility is really changing, as is the landscape within which we operate. So if you're in a global organization, know you're in a lot of different locations and a lot of different issues, and that's kind of part and parcel of this session today. A lot of different issues show up across geographies. For example, here are just a few of the many examples, but within China, Hong Kong, and India today, there's a severe imbalance in supply and demand. And so one of the I consistently hear, we go and talk to executives in these countries, is that the war for talent that we all hear about is really alive and well. People in India, for example, are really struggling to keep their high-quality talent because they easily get poached by other organizations. We were talking to an executive from a hotel chain, and he was saying his biggest problem is that they have expatriates that come and stay at their hotel, and when they identify some really high-quality talent that works at the hotel, they have to double their salaries, and so easily pulling folks away from that organization. So supply and demand is definitely a problem. China is productivity growth, everyone knows it's among the highest in the world today. It is now the second largest economy after the United States. It passed Japan this year and is closing in on the United States. And so obviously, where we are sourcing our materials, where we're hiring talent, that adds a huge challenge. That imbalance of supply and demand obviously creates challenges for selecting our talent, retaining our talent, and the kinds of packages that we offer them. An aging workforce, which means there's going to increasingly this war for talent is going to heat, and we're all still reeling from the global fallout of the financial crisis, which creates a lot of stress. Some places more so than others. Last week, this was where we were really challenged. Today, it's Italy. No doubt this is really affecting us, and it creates a lot of challenges for HR practitioners and global leaders in terms of the things that we hold near and dear to our hearts. So recruitment, engagement, retention. And it really requires a different set of skills. You know, some of you went to graduate school, Texas, like Susan, or wherever you went, but you probably aren't prepared for some of the things that you're confronted with today as we go out and we work globally. That really prompts a question, which takes us into the 5 essentials to live effectively in this increasingly global environment. What do we have to do?
Right, Kyle. As we move into leadership essential number 1, managing with bifocals. In our work with many clients over a long period of time together, Kyle, you've long discussed the 5 leadership essentials to ignite global people practices. And we're both too young to really know anything about wearing bifocals, but outline for our audience who may also be too young to be wearing bifocals, why that, or what do you mean by that?
Sure. All right, well, what do I mean by that? Well, Susan, can you take us back one slide? Slide, please. Okay, slide has disappeared, so let me just go ahead and tell you. What do we mean by managing with bifocals? Well, you think about global organizations today, by definition, they really cut across a lot of different boundaries. So geographic boundaries, socio-cultural, political boundaries. So the operations in our global organizations are in developing countries. Some are in developed countries. They're also, each of those countries within which we operate have the national history. So there are a lot of different things going on simultaneously. You might step back and say, well, it's kind of like onions, layers of onions, and to be effective, leaders must understand complexity. They must understand the layers, and they must understand those different areas within they operate. So what you see on the screen now is really an example of that. Companies like General Electric, Adidas, depending on where you're coming from, they operate in a lot of different countries, and they contend with a lot of differences as you go across these countries. So here are just a couple examples. Moving back, Susan. There you go. Couple examples of countries, and if you think of some of these countries I mentioned, so Maersk, GE, they operate in a lot of countries. HSBC is in over 30 countries. Here's just a couple examples, but you can get a sense of sort of the layers of complexity that we have to operate in. So our talent, for China, we're cutting across different national cultures. In China, you might say they have a collectivistic culture. Obviously, China is a very big country. There are a lot of nuances to their culture, but if you read Bauhaus in the Globe study or Hofstede, some of those folks that talk about national culture, Collectivist culture is what we describe as China versus the United States, which tends to have more of an individualistic culture. So if you have employees, if you're drawing talent from these two countries as an example, you're dealing with different national cultures, and those national cultures affect how people operate in the workplace. The national culture as well within China tends to be fairly hierarchical. A lot of the larger companies within China are state-owned, so it sort of reinforces that hierarchy versus the United States, where it could run from the gamut from very hierarchically structured to very loose, so very variable. So again, when you pull in employees or you're when you are dealing with talent in just these two different countries, things are very different. What they're used to is very different. If you poll employees, there are also big differences in terms of what they look for in the employment relationship. So we're talking about country level preferences. What is it that they value? We're going to show some data in just a minute, but China, they tend to look for continuous learning and development. That's what they want out of their the employment relationship versus the United States, where they're really interested in flexibility and convenient hours. And finally, if you look at the drivers of engagement, again, we see some differences in what people look for in that employment relationship. Going back to the first question, the onion and the different layers that the leaders have to contend with, if you're in a global organization, at any one time, you're going to be dealing with all these differences. Susan, you want to the next slide? Good, thanks. So that's with the context within which the employees come from and within which your operations sit. But also look at kind of the organizational strategy. And again, with global organizations, there are a lot of differences. In this chart, we're trying to differentiate between global organizations in terms of their brand and in terms of their operations. So, for example, the top half of this figure here, this isn't a perfect example, but here are a couple brands that have a couple names that have many brands within them. So General Motors has different products. They operate in different countries. In Australia, they're Holden. In the United States, they're GM. In China, you really talk about Buick more than anything. So many different brands within those organizations. Versus the bottom with KFC and FedEx, where you have a strong brand. You're not operating under multiple brands. People wherever you are in the world really know what these organizations stand for. And also dissected this on the left side versus the right side. Operation. Are they decentralized? Do they tend to be decentralized, or do they tend to be centralized? So you put it all together, and this is obviously a simplification of how organizations are structured. But when you think globally, how organizations want to structure and how they want to project their brand, has implications for how you communicate that brand to your talent, that you're hiring, that you're onboarding. It has implications for how you communicate to customers, and a host of other factors. How do you manage with bifocals? Just kind of wrap this section up. Basically, you have many stakeholders to contend with in global organizations, and that effective leaders, effective global leaders, must be aware of these three things. So, the external environments, the local regulations, understanding of your global clients, whether the organization is a B2B or B2C sort of organization, understanding those global clients and how your organization is perceived, how that brand is perceived within the external environment. The internal environment issues, so how global are you now? Are you early on in that trajectory of being global, just becoming global, or are you far along? And what are your future aspirations? Given the organizational structural globally, some of those things that we talked about in that last table, how can you realistically influence? And then finally, there's your human talent. So it's the people within the organization, the underlying cultures, the national culture that they bring to your organization, so on and so forth. So, three going on here that global leaders really need to bear of. And yes, this has always been true that organizational leaders need to be aware of these things, but in global environment, I would say that they need to know gets more complicated. It's not just knowing their immediate environment, it's knowing that global environment in which they operate.
Takes us to leadership essential number 2, Kyle. We have a pretty sophisticated audience on the call, and I'm wondering, other than many of the standard tools and techniques that most of the people in our audience are probably already implementing, new.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, let's start with culture. Part of understanding global employees is obviously understand their national culture. This isn't necessarily new. But people continue to do research on this, and obviously, because you have experts on the phone, you know that this would take a series of these webinars. We even scratch the surface on the topic of national culture. If you pick up the Globe study volume that describes the history of the Globe study, something like 1,000 pages. So there's a huge amount of information that's out there. But as a former expat, and as you all know, those who have worked globally, culture a huge impact on your experience in the workplace. And while the experts may not always agree on exactly what it is or how we define culture by region, from region to region, or country to country, the experts tend to agree. I would argue they tend to agree that national culture really trumps organizational culture. So that's something that we definitely need to know. Other way to understand, if you want to go ahead and forward, Susan, another way to understand global employees, and this kind of gets into something that's a little bit new, is by looking at their preferences. So how they view their employment relationship, how they view the brand, the value proposition of the organization. And understand how employees view that brand and how they view the value proposition, what they look for in the work environment. Obviously, that can impact your communication strategy and how to recruit, what you say to recruit the right people, what you tell them during the onboarding process, and obviously how you structure the job. So to the extent that you can create alignment between what they're looking for in the job and what you're actually offering, your more engaged employees. So I'll just talk a minute about how we measure it at Valtera, and we're going to turn to some actual data in just a second, and we're going to pull that from Valtera's annual global benchmark study. Now, the survey goes out to over 30 countries annually. We ask a lot of questions, which we can then use to provide benchmark data for clients, and also to go into thought leadership, articles, chapters, those sorts of things. But as in addition to all the other questions we ask in this benchmark study, we ask employees who respond to the survey to their work environment on 27 different characteristics. You see a few examples in the table below. So development, advancement, inclusion, and on and on. And so there are 27 of these, and we ask people to say, what are the top 6 most important features to you in the work environment, as well as the bottom 6, and how's your organization doing on delivering these things? So by asking these questions and having people rank order them, we sense what's going to be most important to those employees. So as soon as you want to forward, then we'll look at some country-level results. Thank you. So we have a handful of countries. I said that we survey over 30, but for the sake of describing these data, and we're going to show 5 countries here. You see them right: Chile, Hong Kong, China, Netherlands, and USA. And each of those are shown indicated by a vertical bar to the left. And we've categorized these in terms of the preferences, the characteristics that employees are looking for in the work environment. So you see that first cluster, challenging work. The height of the bars indicates how strongly that's preferred employees in those particular countries. And so what you see right away in this first cluster for challenging work is that is highly valued. The challenging work is highly valued by people in Chile and the Netherlands, and typically speaking, a bit less so in some of those other countries. In terms of continuous learning and development, that, typically speaking, highly valued in China and Hong Kong, not so much in the other countries. And then finally, flexibility in work hours, you having a convenient schedule, sorts of things, highly valued in the United States and to a greater degree than what we see in the other countries. Okay, so that's kind of how to interpret this. But for global organizations that are trying to recruit and getting a single message about what they offer may have a tough time in some of those parts of the globe where the value prop is what they're offering is not valued by those employees. Okay, so just last point on that previous slide is that there's a lot of variability in what people are looking for in that employment relationship as you look across the globe. Okay, well, go forward, Susan. The other thing to look at is employee engagement and what drives employee engagement with organizations. Now, all of you folks that are on the phone are probably very familiar with the topic of engagement and really understand key driver analyses. But let me touch on this quickly. Global leaders, I would argue, need to understand what drives employees, and we see differences across countries, across regions. Just quickly, why do you do a key driver analysis? Well, if you have about a typical engagement survey, it might be comprised of 40 to 60 questions asking to rate a variety of topic areas. We typically will then give that information. We run a key driver analysis, and we give that information back to managers, and we hear the things that are really impacting your employer. These are the things that drive your employee engagement, and we do that because it helps them focus attention on specific areas to work on, because we all there's plenty of research out there showing that engagement links to a number of important organizational outcomes. So it tends to focus on those. If you want to move on to the next slide, Susan, just an example of some of the differences that we find when we look at the engagement drivers across different countries. And we can show you data for countries, but it would extend way past the slide. Just for the sake of illustration, here are 6 countries: China, Brazil, Germany, Australia, UK, and Hong Kong. They're arrayed from left to right. Let me just explain the table a little bit. Arrayed from left to right in terms of current engagement levels at the country level. So China tends to have higher favorability on engagement, which is why it's on the left, and Hong Kong, which is on the right. Hong Kong has the lowest engagement of those 6 countries. China has the highest engagement levels, and everybody falls in between. The other information here, if you look to the left, vertical indicates the strength of the item in terms of impacting engagement. So, for example, China, the stress driver of employee engagement is trust and respect. That's the one driver of engagement. The last driver is having enough information to job done. All important within China, all 6 of these drivers. So first row indicates the strongest driver, last row indicates the number 6 driver, but these are all important. I've created the actual issues or items so that where you see blue, for example, people here cooperate, you get a sense of how common that shows up across these countries. So you see people cooperating here as a key driver of employee engagement, regardless of country. With people treating one another with respect, that's a fairly common driver. Having enough information to get the job done, and so on and so forth, are common drivers. So this is at the country level. It's a oversimplification of what you would find in your own organization, because there'd be differences. But our point here is that when you scan across these countries, you see overlap in what drives employee engagement. So for an HR leader, there are some things that you could do on a global scale to impact your employee engagement, but we'll see a lot of variation. And so to that complexity of a global work environment, there's not a size-fits-all for driving employee engagement across the globe. If you happen to be operating in 30-plus countries, you're going to look. You need to do to engage your employees is going to vary across those different groups. And HR leaders really need to understand this. So the next one. So just kind of sum up this section. Experts tend to agree that national culture drives organizational culture. You shouldn't fight it. You should learn to with national culture. But as global HR leaders, you need to understand what those nuances are. And we can also go into some of the current technology that's out there, some of the new approaches. We can look at employee preferences. We can look at employee drivers, look at the similarities and the differences across the globe, across the areas within which our organization operates, and craft the right strategies to attract, to retain, and to engage those employees. And as HR leaders in a global environment, you play a critical role in doing that.
So that takes us into our leadership essential number 3. Now, you've recently published a white paper and done quite a few blog article posts at Valtera.com on this audience. I believe this audience is unique. In the overall scheme of things, is it really worth our very busy clients and organizational leaders that it warrants a separate strategy?
Good, Susan. And as a consultant, I would say have to say that it depends. Some things that are fairly common across HR leaders, and we'll look at that in just a second, but also some differences. And I think as people that are responsible for recruitment, selection, onboarding, training, developing our employees, all those sorts of things that HR leaders do, I think it's absolutely critical to understand all these things that we've talked about, that they develop a global mindset. I also need to understand HR leaders. So take a look at the next slide at some data for HR leaders within organizations and ask, what is it that drives these folks? So what engages our HR leaders? This, again, pulling from Valtera's norm database, but we were asked recently to provide commentary for an upcoming HR magazine article about global HR leaders, what drives them, they look for in the employment relationship, and what engages them. This is just a snapshot of some of the data that we talked about for that upcoming article. Here, split in the table, you can interpret it the same way. It shows the driver results. We're talking about HR and shared service professionals in different regions, and you can see them from left to right: North America, Latin America, APAC, and Europe. The other engagement table, the way to interpret this is the first column is the region with the highest level of engagement, and column to the right, Europe, is the region with the lowest level of engagement. So a high left to right. And again, top drivers of engagement. The first one indicates the highest driver of engagement for North America. The bottom one shows the number 6 driver of engagement for North America, and one you can scan across and interpret that. And I won't read all of those, but again, color-coded those according to similar drivers. So people here cooperate. You see in all those regions having the skills and abilities to do the job shows up in all those regions. I'm also using the same colors that you saw on the previous table. So what this tells me is, once again, if you have HR leaders, it's mixed. So as you scan across countries, across regions of the world, what engages your HR leaders, they're common. You might even call them universal drivers of engagement, but also some differences and some nuances. And so organizations need to understand not only what drives their employees, but they also understand what drives their HR leaders, because those folks play an important role in global organizations. But engagement alone is not enough. I would say that there's a class of skills as well that are requirements for global leaders. So let me tell you, this is also pulling from application that had recently a volume called Going Global, which I edited. So we have different authors writing chapters around all those topics that are important to HR leaders. So onboarding, development, we see examples here. But about everything that we do as HR OD practitioners. And I went into this volume and I thought, these are experts that wrote all the chapters, know a lot about these topics, and the whole book was about each of these topics from a global perspective. I went through this and I thought, well, let's boil it down and see if we can find some nuggets of wisdom for HR leaders on a global scale. What are some things that they need to possess to be effective. I had 3 core competencies. They're published in the article. I also combined, and we'll look at those competencies in just a second, also combine that with some qualitative data that I collected into chief human resource officers from global organizations, where I said, what is it that you think is critical for the success of your global HR leaders? Go ahead, Susan. And here, these are, I use the term competencies sort of loosely. They haven't validated, but here are things that I think are fairly important for global HR practitioners that are working across the globe. I mentioned before, if you've been to graduate school, you find that things aren't really what you learned about in graduate school. So to be effective in a global environment, you pick up a lot of knowledge along the way. So number one competency, I would say, is just flexibility and adaptability. So if you're working in a global environment, it helps to have a learning orientation and a willingness to adapt to changing conditions. If you read up on any of the research around expatriates and what makes them successful, they talk things like having basic transferable skills such as adaptability, perspective-taking, problem-solving, tolerant ambiguity, those sorts of things. So what makes expatriates successful, I think, often helps global leaders be successful too. It pulls in on a lot of the same characteristics. Number two, I would say that increasingly HR leaders need to be able to understand and apply analytics, and I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail. But they need to think like a CEO. Treat HR as a decision science. And be able to demonstrate the impact of what you're doing, and actually be able to speak like our CEOs do and our executive leaders do. I think that is also key. And finally, nurture a global mindset. Go into a little more around this as well. That's understanding local conditions, culture, and being able to leverage that sort of information. I think I boil it down to 3 competencies for global HR leaders. Those are the ones that I would pull out.
How that really, you've set up your Good Leadership Essential number 4, which is understanding and applying analytics. And I think those of us in organizations have found that that's easy to say and quite difficult to do. So would love it if you would help our audience about better, more relevant lines of sight. Organizations really are measuring what's easy to get rather than really taking a look at data that matters. So can you help our audience with that issue?
Yep. If you go ahead. I would say that we've all experienced this in our jobs. We're all being asked to do more with less these days. And in a post-GFC environment, global financial crisis environment, although that's not really over, we're still struggling with that. But in that sort of environment, we're being asked to do more with the same or more with less, and really to demonstrate the value of what we're doing. So to do this, I think, as I said, HR leaders really need to understand some of the metrics, what sort of metrics executives pay attention to, how to measure success within their organization, or how to evaluate success, and to really, when they're considering interventions or evaluating interventions, they need to be thinking about how will they demonstrate the return on the investment for that program. Or if they're talking with the CEO, would he or her be willing to spend money on that sort of intervention? And I think if you ask those sorts of questions, it guides the kinds of analytics then that you naturally use. Provide some examples. First example, of being able to show impact, and this one may be familiar to many of you on the phone, and has to do with linkage research that organizational researchers have been able to use to identify the statistical relationship between employee engagement, in this example, and financial outcomes or organizational outcomes. So briefly, what we have in these slides are comparisons of engagement within organizations. So a green bar indicates the top quartile, on the top quartile in terms of engagement levels The orange bar to the left shows those on the bottom quartile in terms of engagement and the significant difference it has on return on assets. Same with profitability, same with shareholder value. So basically, this is a way of saying, there's value in working on employee engagement within this organization. And if you demonstrate these sorts of linkages and use the financial metrics that your executives pay attention to, that is one way to think like a CEO, one way to demonstrate that impact, and it's consistent with what executives are looking for and how they're measured too. So what's the possibility? This is an example of some really realistic choice modeling that Valtera does. Question here is, how do we improve retention rates among our employees? And if you have a marketing background, you might recognize this. So using some of the EVP work that we've done, you can identify those things that employees value most in that value proposition. And you can cluster these into different ways. You can ask them a question. What would you stay here another 2 years? And then you can provide some of those things that they've said they value and vary those slightly. So if one of those boxes shows a slight variation on the things that we're providing. So what would get you to stay for 2 years? Your current level of pay versus a 2% increase in pay versus a 5% increase, or none of these would get me to stay. So you have a series of choices, and this allows us to test out different scenarios before we actually make any changes to the employment deal. And if you want to go ahead to the next slide, Susan, you can also quantify this. So this is a simulator that we've created. We can put those options in the simulator, and you can say, if they choose A, B, and D, here's what it's going to cost you, and here's going to be the return on your investment. Here's how it's going to impact your organization in terms of future retention rates. This is what it's going to cost you to do this. So you can very clearly, with something like this, your executive and say, here's the cost, here's the trade-off of these options, here's the benefit to your organization. So they're kind of talking about pulling in analytics and talking in terms that your executives will really buy into, your CEO will buy into. And then final example, so much demonstrating impact as a philosophy or a way of thinking about what you should be measuring within your organization. We do these in our organization. So we have onboarding surveys, we have engagement surveys, we have job transition surveys of various sorts, and we have exit surveys. So you can measure the entire employee life cycle. And using some of the methodology of linkage research and tying all these different metrics together over time, we can really use it to demonstrate the value of all these different things that we engage in. It really is something we should be doing. We're collecting these measures, and we should be linking these measures together. So to kind of sum